Hello, you wonderful people, and welcome to another episode of Not Too Comic Book. This being a show where it's about TV shows that are adaptations of comic books. For today's episode, I'm going to talk about the latest episode of Riverdale. A lot of interesting things went down in this episode, so let's break it down. Obviously, we're picking up after the last episode. Obviously, not the homecoming situation that everybody expected. Even it's, I even like that monologue from, voiceover from Jughead talking about the fact is that in that moment, like, obviously so much had happened for everybody. They led different lives. Yet in this moment, all they were focused on was, hey, let's save Riverdale, but not about, hey, us. Because obviously didn't even leave off on the best terms amongst the group. They slowly but surely dissolved. And that's a conversation too, just because it's like, that happens with a lot of high school. Like I think some people are fortunate enough to be in a position where it's like, hey, like you stayed friends with the people you were in high school with, but other times it's just a situation of you just grow apart. I mean, that's every facet of life that kind of happens, but obviously some bonds might be worth, fighting for while others might not be, and I think that's kind of like a decision and choice that has to kind of be made in life. And I think that's kind of the interesting thing about this Riverdale situation is that, these 7 years, it took something kind of bad to kind of bring them back together, but hey, it brought them back together, and I think it's going to remind them of like why they were such a tight-knit group. It's still that thing of like, hey, we're talking, but we're not talking. Like, there's still like so much about everybody's lives we haven't really dived into. Like, for example, Jughead, probably like the worst off amongst everybody just because he's got the money issues, he's got debt collectors, he's in a dry spell when it comes to writing books. So, speak of that really quickly, it's kind of pissed off Sweet Pea, Fang, as well as Tony, because it's like, oh, you wrote about us in your book. Yeah, you might have changed names, but it wasn't like, it's not going to be that hard for people to realize like, oh, who we are. Like, I mean, that's always the thing, like, write kind of what closer. I mean, that's always been Jughead's thing. He always wrote close to home. That this isn't the first time he's used, but it's also like they don't like the light that he like wrote them in the book, and it's just like you've made a lot of enemies, which I'm assuming it has to deal with a lot of people in Riverdale he wrote about, so that's going to be interesting. But there's also like the Betty phone call, because obviously Betty talks to him about the fact is like he's like, why didn't you ever reach out? She's like, yeah, after your I think she said like your voicemail, I didn't think you'd ever want to talk to me again. And like he's like, well, I'm sorry it came off that way. But I mean, I'm wondering what went down that made that a situation. Maybe it was still in the aftermath of the Archie and Betty revelation at the 7 years ago. Maybe that still plagued them, because that was still left so unresolved, because it's like, yeah, because even Jughead said, like they didn't even really talk about it afterwards, before she left for college and everything. So it's trying to pick up life, in Riverdale, almost like nothing's happened, but so much has happened, not just to the town, but each one of them. Betty's back in town, and it's like, oh, Polly's working pretty damn late. And the last interaction that we're at least aware of between Betty and Polly was that phone call last season. So it's like, have they had any interactions before then? I mean, it seems like it's probably a situation where like Betty and Alice, like, because remember they made the whole point of like, it's like, hey, we'll meet up even if it's just us. But it makes you wonder with the conversations that go down later on, like, Polly kind of throws it in her face, like, you haven't been around, like, you haven't been much of a sister, you haven't been that much of a daughter, like, you don't get to just come into town and like judge me, like, after being back from one day. You don't know me, you don't know what my life is, So I'm wondering, has Betty not kept up with like Call Me Home? It's just probably she's been so focused on her own life, and just once again, Riverdale holds so many demons for them that it's probably like, I'm not that willing and ready to go back to Riverdale yet. It's just, and probably just kept making excuses, because it's like, I get to live my own life, and what I want, she being the ambitious person that she is, that going, taking her life in her own reins type of situation. So maybe that, I don't know, maybe there's been other extenuating. Once again, it's 7 years. A lot can change in 7 years. There's a lot of backstory that is going to have to be filled in over the course of the season of explaining, like, the ins and outs of just everybody's, lives in the grand scheme of things. And since I'm on that conversation of, Polly and, like, Betty did try to have a conversation with Polly, because I think, like, it never really registered to her until, like, she's like, oh, man, like, Charles had all these recorded phone conversations, and one of the tapes she played was a conversation that her yelling at Polly and saying, like, oh, you're kind of, because for Betty, it's like, I wasn't there for you. I wasn't as sensitive to like the whole farm situation. Like, she was like, I wasn't there with you at post the farm, and I wasn't, much of a sister, but I'd like to try and be. So it, like I said, it even seems like they haven't really spoken at all in that 7-year time period. Obviously, not even after post farm stuff. It seems like they're, So I'm curious in the long run, like what's going to happen there, because obviously, Archie did find her with the ghoulie, so. I think it's just a situation of got to do whatever it takes. I'm curious at her mom though, like, because I think it is a thing. Like, I think Alice is like, you don't have any right to kind of judge us, Elizabeth. You haven't been around. Like, we have our own issue, because it's like Polly doing what she's doing is also helping pay the mortgage, which once again must mean, just with the current circumstances, it make you wonder, does that mean FP never came back around? Like, FP might be, like, when he left with Jellybean, he might have ever came back to Riverdale. So, because I would think if FP was around, at least he'd help out in that regard or something like that. But we haven't heard not hide nor hair about that. So, I'm curious. But that's what I'm saying is, it just seems like Alice has just kind of been dealing with things on her own, and Polly and the twins. So, Polly, I think for Alice, it's almost like, any reflection on Polly is kind of a reflection on her, like Alice as a mother. It's like, as a mother, as a grandmother, like, it's like if you're judging Polly as a mother, that means you're judging me as a grandmother and a mother as well. I think that's kind of, Alice probably feels like, because her children have always meant the world to her. And, I think she, prided herself on, like, I think she, like, and she's a good mom, but I think she's probably going to be a little harder on herself by being like, we're doing whatever we can to survive. It's like, you weren't here in the trenches with us when it came to this situation, so you don't get to judge Polly and in turn judge me to a certain extent, So we'll kind of see. But other than that, there is the whole Veronica and Archie thing. It's like, she's married now, and it's like, who have you dated? He's like, I haven't really had any relationships. The last serious relationship I was in was with you, Veronica, which maybe that speaks volume. Maybe it says, hey, he's enjoying his single life. Or that could just be folks showing that, hey, he's been so dedicated to the military that, like, he just hasn't had much of a social life or, relationship subsequently since. I don't know. Maybe there's been other people. Maybe there haven't. But even Veronica being like, it's okay to kind of have flings or whatever, Archie, So, which... Veronica's dealing with her own issues this episode when it turns out like, my accounts have been frozen. I'm also being followed around. It turns out it's Chad because he's possessive, and it's just like, that marriage wasn't the... I mean, it makes you wonder, is it kind of almost this sad cycle of like, it might be a little similar to like maybe Hiram and Hermione. We don't know. Like, we don't know the ins and outs of their relationship, but we saw where things kind of ended up. And potentially that could be like, where things kind of go with Veronica and Chad. That it's just like, Hiram in his own right can be controlling. I mean, you could make an argument like, well, maybe that's what that's kind of stemming from. Like, in a sense, Veronica might have married her own dad. For all she, there's a potential. Like, I think you could definitely see some similarities between Chad and Hiram. I mean, we'll kind of have to wait and see on that. But she kind of told him off later because obviously she got some money off the on the side. Like, obviously all the like jewelry he had gotten her. Like, well, there was that egg and that it looked like a pearl necklace. Like, she ended up selling those for cash, even getting a gun, which she used later on to pop the tires on the people following her. But well, she did go to her dad for help, which is like awkward time to go to your dad for help, considering your dad is literally choking the life out of town and everyone's doing their best to fight against him, and you're kind of going to him for help, which is interesting. And because Reggie had suggested it. It's like, no matter what happens, your dad will help you. And it's like, when it came down to it, he didn't, because her dad is petty. He's bringing up something from 7 years ago, like, you hurt me saying that, so I'm not actually going to help you. I'm going to make you, deal with your situation on your own, lick your own wounds. Like, you want to deal with Chad, you have to deal with him. You're going to have to get your hands dirty. I wonder if it's the reason why she's kind of reluctant. Like, maybe he comes from a certain family as well, where it's like, you don't want to get on their bad side. Maybe that's kind of what that's stemming from. I don't know. But he was also joyful. But, you can get out of here. It's like, okay. Like, he got too much delight from it. But it's just like, well, which is interesting, because like obviously him and Veronica have had their tit for tat type of situation. She's always been his daddy's, like, she's always been so important to him, but it's like, I think that relationship's gotten soured over the years, because it's like, nah, you want to come, want to treat me like a bit bad wolf, but then it's daddykins when you need something from me, when you want to get your hands dirty. So, but I think that's definitely, like I said, it's definitely their relationship has gotten a lot more complicated over the years. Like I said, it's been a lot of roller coasters, ups and downs. I think it's going to be probably a full-blown, like, family war again, essentially. I'm curious to see where, like, the whole... I mean, we got a peek at, with Hermione last episode, but I'm curious about... Obviously, they talked about like, Hermosa took the rum business to Florida, whether she'll, like, be weaved back into the storyline or not. We'll see, because obviously Hiram's got his own plans for Riverdale. But more so than anything, Veronica shutting Chad down, being like, you're controlling me, you're following me, so you're going to unfreeze our accounts in 30 minutes, because most of the money we made is ours, because obviously it's a whole thing of like, she makes more money than me, he wants to feel, I'm the man in the relationship, I have to make more money than you, like, he's got a very fragile male ego, so... I don't think that's definitely not the last we've heard of Chad. Chad's too damn possessive and too much of an asshole that I'm like, yeah, that's going to turn into something. He's going to probably come to Riverdale, send up, like, do whatever he can to get Veronica back. Because it does almost seem like he's treating, not almost, he definitely is treating Veronica more like it's almost like a arm candy type of thing of like, you're mine, like you're my property, like I kind of bring you out, and it's like, we're gonna have a baby when I want to. I mean, granted, there was a whole helicopter crash situation, so it's like that changes a lot. Like, maybe he wasn't always like this, but maybe that circumstance kind of brought out what was, or maybe it's just like Veronica's finally seen Chad for who he really is, like him stifling her. Because even Hiram's getting into it. It's like, yeah, you got associated with someone who didn't recognize you for being the lodge that you are, being the very ambitious person that you are, for even trying to stifle that ambition. So we'll kind of see. And obviously for Archie, dealing with the ghoulies back home, obviously it's like, like Sheriff Keller, once again, he's the only one, because the department's funds have been slashed. So Archie, is able to kind of do a little infiltration, obviously seeing, learning that Reggie's leading to private security at Soldale, but also, like, he tips off the, because even Keller had warned him, like, yeah, it's most likely, which I also thought was kind of interesting. At one point, he referred to him as Tom. I was like, at first he called him Mr. Keller, but then he was like Tom, and it's like, that's interesting. I mean, to be fair, it's like you're older now, so. But at the same time, I just thought that was interesting. But it might just because he kind of sees them as like equals now. It's like, maybe because of his military experience, and now, like, it's like I'm back home. I'm not the boy I once was. Like, maybe that's what it is. I just thought it was interesting, just in that same scene, him going from Mr. Keller to Tom. I thought that was interesting. But Keller had to let him know, like, if you go ask Reggie about the ghoulies, he'll most likely tip them off, which they were kind of accounting for. So Archie was just using it as an opportunity to get the lay of the land, so brings everyone in: Sweet Pea, Fang, Kevin, and Tom, and was that it? And Betty. Because, with her FBI experience, it's like, okay, we can go in there, we can bust them. It's like, no one gets hurt. It was interesting because, like, Archie coming at this from, like, like with his military training, coming at it from a tactical standpoint. Go in there, they bust some heads, and luckily they were able to take down the ghoulies. And even later on, we see Archie and Betty cleaning his house. And it's like, hey, it's like, you want pizza or something like that? He's like, yeah. And it's just like the look in their eyes. It's like, I'm about to go take a shower. I'm kind of sweaty. She's like, oh yeah, me too. And it's like, and they get to doing their thing. And it's like, it's like, hey, that between us. It's like, yeah, we never really had an opportunity in high school. It's like, yeah, but should we tell? It's like, no, Veronica's married. Jughead and me broke up years ago. We haven't dated since. So, we're adults. We're he's like, but is this like she's like, no, we're friends. But that's the thing. It's like, they have a complicated relationship. Like, Archie and Betty have, like, had a thing since they were kids. So for it to kind of circle back around like this, like, you never know what could become of it. It could just stay a friends with benefit situation, but maybe it's like, maybe things have changed. Maybe, because you see the look on Betty's face. It might not just be, it might be kind of what she wanted, but obviously she was with Jughead, but now that's no longer a thing. And it's like, maybe that leaves the door open for that. it's definitely gonna be interesting, especially because Archie is like, oh, let's get together, the gang, just the four of us, and hang out. Like, he wants to make kind of a point of that. But once again, it's like, oh, let's kind of pick things up. It's like, yeah, but we were supposed to meet up every year, like at Pops. We didn't. Once again, we don't know if Jughead did. Like, we saw Jughead show up with year one. Who knows if the others did as well? I mean, once again, did they just keep making excuses of why they couldn't show up? That just life kept getting in the way, which that could easily just, it might not be a thing if they were blowing him off. It could have just been, hey, life's been getting in the way, or it could just be they were blowing him off. Like I said, maybe Jughead showed up one year, maybe someone else did the next, and it was just never all of the group at once. Maybe it's one, maybe it's some. Maybe none of them. Like, maybe after that, like, Jughead was like, well, they didn't show up, so I'm not going to show up either. So maybe that was the only year that Jughead showed up. We don't know. Maybe they'll kind of fill us in on that later on. But obviously a big part in this situation is obviously Hiram coming to Tony about, like, getting her, like, setting up a situation of, like, oh, students from Riverdale could go to Stonewall and be free. It's like, oh, plus they'll get a free scholarship or something like that. But Tony's like, yeah, but you sit on a board of Stonewall Prep, so, like, basically everything kind of comes back to you. Which, in this moment, I had thought about it during the episode. I was like, has Tony and Hiram ever really had many conversations over the course of the series? I mean, everyone's had their interactions, but I feel like the core group, it makes sense. Like, Betty, Jughead, and Archie, especially because, like, they're so close to Veronica, it makes sense. But everyone's had their own interactions with Hiram over the years. But even I was like, I don't know if I've ever necessarily seen them have a one-on-one conversation. Tony and Hiram. I don't think I've seen that. I could be, like, totally misremembering. Even if it was a thing, I feel like, because I'm even trying to think, like, I don't even think I've ever had, like, heard Cheryl and him. Like, it's such an interesting thing when you're like, you look back and you're like, I don't think I've ever seen certain characters interact with each other. Like, I don't think I've ever seen, like, Cheryl and Tony interact with Hiram. Maybe they have. It never, if it has, it was never as, like, big and an explosive of a thing like Veronica or Archie or Jughead. Like, I'm even trying to think. I don't even know if Betty's really had too many interactions with Hiram on her own. Like, she's been caught up in a lot of the stuff that Hiram's done, and, like, obviously the core group has kind of fought against a lot of stuff Hiram's done, but I don't know if they've had many interactions. Obviously, Archie and Veronica are the ones who've had the most. Obviously, like, Veronica would have the most, being his daughter and everything, but still. Him even throwing her under the bus, being like, oh, she's a dancer, and she owns this club, and blah, 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 blah. Like, he's trying to besmirch her name, because, like, you're the guidance counselor at this high school, and you've got this other life, and trying to make it seem seedy and stuff. Obviously, it's a situation of, like, Riverdale High might not be able to be open, like, come Monday, just because so much of their funding's been cut. They don't even have many teachers. Like, even Kevin's like, yeah, Alice was pointing out, I was like, hey, you're teaching, like, 5 classes, aren't you? And he's like, yeah. So, yeah, like, Riverdale's not in the best condition, not even Riverdale High. And so Archie's willing to try and help out. And it's like, but it has to be, like, qualified people that act as teachers. So he ends up bringing it up to Jughead, Veronica, and Betty about the whole, like, hey, let's, let us be the teachers. Like, obviously he's trying to start our ROTC program. It's like, we're alumni from here and everything. So it's like, it'd be our way to kind of give back to Riverdale. It's like, it's only gonna be like a month or two, it's like, with their businesses and everything, it's like, well, you can always commute for your job and stuff. Veronica and Jughead, you can ride anywhere. And obviously for Betty, I think for her, it's like obviously the complicated situation where her and Polly stand, and it's like, I want to stick around so I can repair the relationship with my family. So for her, it's like, Quantico can always, wait. So I think that kind of speaks volumes too, that everyone's kind of like, yeah, I think everyone kind of gives excuses, but it's like, honestly, like, I'm sure for Veronica, it's like, yeah, complicated stuff is waiting for her in New York, so probably giving it some time to breathe and kind of figuring things out. Yeah, Jughead got that complicated situation of, like, oh yeah, debt collectors and money. I'm wondering, is there going to be kind of a potential bond between him and Pop's granddaughter, and her name, Tabitha Tate, right? Like, what's going to happen with that? Like, is it just going to be like a friendship thing, or is it going to be more? Because I don't know how old she is. That's why I'm like, I don't know. I don't know whether she's like the same age as them or not. But because it was like potentially what they're setting that up to be. I'm like, huh, because obviously, because he's trying to get a job, but she's like, whoa, I don't run the business like my dad, like my grandpa, like he gave you a running tab and stuff like that. You sucking up the Wi-Fi, doing whatever you want to, just all ordering coffee. It's like, no, you actually pay for food here, or you know. So obviously that's creating this interesting dynamic. Obviously it's like, hey, like in a couple days, like, because she eventually offers him the job because I think her grandpa being there kind of softened the blow a little, just because it's like, you know, he's you know, Jughead's been in there for years, so it's just like a regular customer. It's like, you know, Pops and him have that tight relationship, so it's like she's probably like, all right, because Grandpa wants me to give him the, like, all right, fine, I'll give you the job. He's like, oh, cool. Could you call the debt collectors in a couple of days and let them know I'm sending them like I'll send him like half my paycheck, so he's got to do that. Well, potentially working as a teacher, I'm sure that's gonna, you know, I mean, teachers don't get paid much, but I'm sure any money is going to help him right now. He was in the process of writing a story because he was supposed to be writing this speech for Pops, which was a very beautiful speech. I thought it was nice. It's like, oh, they gave him like a Riverdale Letterman jacket, and it's like, oh, because Pops had talked about the fact is he kind of had to drop out and take over the business after his dad passed away, which I'm like, oh, like, maybe that came up. I don't remember that ever coming up about, like, oh, you know, especially considering what Archie was doing, kind of running the Andrew Constructions, like, so I don't remember that ever coming. I mean, to be fair, the same thing applied to Fred. Like, Fred had to take over the business after his dad died. So, like, and sadly, it seems like a all too common story in Riverdale to a certain extent. But it was like, yeah, they give him a jacket because it's like, yeah, he was never able to graduate. So, you know, that was a very, like, sentimental gift. And, you know, but, you know, Jughead's story about, like, you know, this is who Pops is, but he's also, you know, a good listener, and he's, you know, he gave a home to, like, you know, the wayward souls of Riverdale. So, you know, Pops is like the heart and soul of Riverdale. So I'm curious, it's probably gonna turn into a complicated thing later on. But when it was all said and done, like, he had sent over something. I guess he had used Pops as a little bit of his inspiration for, I mean, not probably a lot of his inspiration for whatever story he was writing, and he turned it into his, like, editor or whatever, or his publisher, and it's like, yeah, man, yeah, they're loving that, and we want the story to be this. It's essentially they want him to use the crappy situation in Riverdale as a story, which he's like, I don't want to write about that. It's like, you're going to, hangs up. So he's in this complicated thing of, like, he needs to get on that, because if you don't, you have to refund that money, which he doesn't have. He's already in debt. On top of that, you know, like I said, I feel like out of anyone, he's kind of on the biggest spiral down, which I don't know. I guess the argument you can almost make is his life kind of coming full circle, like him just kind of struggling, kind of living on his own. Like, yeah, that happened. That's where things kind of began for Jughead at the beginning of the series, because obviously, like, once again, he wasn't living with his dad, and like I said, you see a lot of parallels in between him and his dad. Like I said, the drinking and just kind of, like, complicated, I think, job situation. Just where he is in his life, like I said, you could just see parallels between that and his dad. But other than that, I'm curious. Like, I think because he already has so much spite for, like, the book he wrote, like, using a lot of, like I said, maybe that plays a part in some of the relationships, like how some of the dynamics are going to change. Like, Archie, amongst anyone, is he makes it seem like, oh, everything's okay. Like, cause he feels like the most when it comes to the characters who are trying to, like, pick things up and it seems like everything's normal. It seems like he's trying to do it the most, but maybe because of his experiences, or maybe that kind of plays into it a little bit. But along with all of that, I'm curious to see how that whole, you know, him writing a story situation is going to end up, or Jughead writing that story, because especially if it's going to be kind of about all that, and you see him kind of looking at Tabitha during all that, because it's like, yeah, he probably feels bad about, like, that being the heart of the story. Like, it's like, oh, like, I'm profiting off of, like, the tragedies and the terrible things going down in Riverdale, your grandfather kind of being part of it, you know. So it's just like, I think he feels grimy about it, but it's kind of like, I don't have much of a choice. I'm sure that's going to turn into a nasty, complicated storyline in its own right of, like, oh, like, someone's going to find out about what he's writing. It might even be when the book gets published. I was about to say, like, what story had a similar element? Oh, I was trying to remember, because I was like, there was something that was very similar to this. The Umbrella Academy. it had a very, Vanya's storyline about like, oh, how the family kind of resented, like, oh, you wrote a book about us and you kind of put us in a terrible light and just put family business out there. I knew there was a parallel. I knew there was another show that did something similar, and I just couldn't remember what. And it's like, yeah. Once again, it's not like this is the first time Jughead's done it. It's happened before and as well, but regardless. Obviously, luckily, they were able to, with Cheryl's help, because she was reluctant to get involved, because for Cheryl, it's like, yeah, I don't have enough money to even take care of the reconstruction of Thornhill, but it's like, it's also because, like, she thinks that if she can put more money into it, like, maybe it'll keep the curse that is her/her family kind of at bay. But Tony's like, if you ever loved me, if what we had ever meant anything to you, if I ever meant anything to you, please do this. Because for her, it's like Riverdale's kind of falling apart, but it's like, if we can hold on to Riverdale high, then maybe, just maybe, this could be the foundation of, because obviously Cheryl only came mainly for Pop's retirement, but that was about it. But, it's like, all right, so luckily with Cheryl's backing, which is like, which part of me wonders, like, is there another reason why Cheryl didn't want to really hand over the money? Is because what we saw at the end of the last episode, maybe it's like the money they have, they're going to have to go through a little bit illicit means to get that money. Maybe not. We don't know the full scale of that whole, like, all right, maybe you can forge other people's work, put out some really good forgeries so we can sell. So it, like, they might be in some like shady dealings themselves just to make ends meet. I don't know. We'll have to wait. Obviously, we haven't spent enough time with Cheryl to really kind of find the ins and outs of what's going on there. But they were able to kind of hold on to Riverdale High, but Hiram got what he wanted by extortion and just fear, by basically kind of dissolving the town of Riverdale, and so obviously pushing everything towards Sodale. So that's definitely going to be interesting to see where things kind of going out front. But also we have the thing at the end where obviously Betty's trying to get in contact with Polly, but couldn't. And we see at the end, like, she's running from who's ever in that truck, which I guess we're kind of dealing with, like, a potential truck driver, serial killer type of situation. Because obviously, like, it got brought up at the last moment of the last episode, but I guess, like, the woman that had disappeared, like, it's like, Jughead being like, yeah, she won't. Like, I think a lot of this is, probably a lot has happened. Like, I'm wondering, is this situation something super recent, or is this something that's been happening over the course of the past 7 years, and it's just gotten built up more and more and more? We'll have to wait and see, but it seems like Polly's found herself in a terrible situation, and hopefully Betty will be able to do something about it, like before, worse comes to worse. We don't know. Maybe this will correlate in some shape or form. I doubt it, but, maybe this will help, Betty in some shape or form, because she's suffering from PTSD. I'm curious how many people know about her circumstances. Like, maybe only, I don't know if it was written in the newspapers about her being held by TBK for like those 2 weeks, or maybe that's what I'm curious about, because it didn't seem like her family really knew, or if they did, they probably weren't talking about it. I don't know. Maybe that's even more reason why Betty probably like cut herself off from a lot of people. I mean, granted, that was still within still fresh enough for her to still be going to. I mean, granted, I think a long while after something like that happened, you'd be going to therapy, but it was I'm sure it's kind of like a mandatory thing as well. But it's like, I'm wondering if this potential case that she might get mixed up in Riverdale going to help in any shape or form with the TBK thing. Will there be any correlation? I mean, hell, maybe it might even be a thing that her being in Riverdale, TBK might have taken an interest in her, and finding out maybe her solving whatever this is in Riverdale might draw him to Riverdale to be like, oh, I'm following you, Betty. I haven't forgotten the time we spent together type of thing. I'm reading too much into it, but I think that could be potentially an angle we go down. Archie and Jughead are, Jughead's moving in with Archie, so I'm like wondering, like, it's like, oh, like they've lived together, prior to now, way before now too. So it's not like this is something completely new, but I'm curious with the new dynamics and everything, especially the whole potentially him and Betty thing, like how that's going to affect that group of four. if that ever comes out. But it is kind of like, let's keep it a secret, like keep it between us. Yeah, we're adults, but I'm sure like us getting together after 7 years, that'll probably open some old wounds, plus probably cause some complications. So let's keep that to ourselves. But it's like, that might be, an issue, especially if Jughead's staying there. But also Jughead's not telling anyone he's got money issues, because it's like, what about the 5 seasons? He's like, it's too rich for me. He means that literally. But, because he wasn't even living there. He was in the underground bunker. But, like I said, not letting anyone know. I'm assuming that's eventually going to come out. But we'll see. Now, like I said, just a lot of interesting things to kind of keep in mind. I'm curious to see where all of this ends up taking us going forward into the next episode. But really, that's all I want to talk about. Until next time we meet, be happy, be safe, live life to the fullest, and enjoy it. Good day, and goodbye.